Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session on building diversity with intention. My name is Jonathan McBride. In prior lives, I was the head of personnel for President Obama and head of, or global head of inclusion and diversity at BlackRock, and now have a firm advising clients. And actually, before we get started, I'm just going to have my fellow panelists just introduce themselves very quickly. You can read their bios, so we won't go into long intros, and then we want to get into this conversation around intention. For any of you who've been in the room for a little while, you can see that our warm-up call suggests that these folks are going to talk to each other quite a bit, so I want to get them talking right away.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm Natlee Green. I'm the VP of People at Class.
Oh, that's it?
Oh, they can see my bio if they want to know more.
He got videotaping the audience.
Toney, founding managing partner, Plexo Capital.
Marissa, Farrar. I joined in May as the Chief People Officer for Turnitin.
Hi, Odessa Jenkins. I'm the president of Emtrain.
Excellent. So, and we were told that you can ask questions if you want, so jump in at any time. Just raise your hand. We're going to have to repeat your question so it gets picked up on the audio. So allow us to do that and we'll answer. But feel free to jump in at any time. We'd love this to be as interactive as possible. But so for the group, when we talked on the phone, I had asked you the question, like, what jumped out at you about this session? What did you hope it would be about? And everybody kind of keyed in on the word intention, or with intention. So maybe start there. Talk a little bit about why you started with intention, what it kind of means to you.
So for me, you know, I feel as a Black woman on executive leadership team, I'm privileged, right? So if I'm in a position to make a decision on who is represented at the company I work for, it has to be done intentionally and with purpose, right? I have to have, you have to have metrics. Why is this important? Where's our foundation and where are we trying to get to? And so it's not going to happen organically. I have to have a plan and a purpose to actually create representation. So.
Others? Anyone can jump in.
You know, I believe that intent drives your outcomes. I think that's the thing that excited me about it is if you go into it with a certain desire or purpose, then you usually get that out of it. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion in particular, if you are intending to do something for the purpose of optics, we talked about optics earlier, then you get the optics and then you stop. I think real change happens when your intent is to have real change.
So I want to ask you a follow-up question, but anybody can jump in on this, which is related, which is, do you feel, so what you're arguing for is that intention has been there all the time, maybe the word or the concept is getting more attention right now, but as you think about meeting the moment of the last year, maybe even going further back into the Me Too moment, is this a time for greater intentionality and signaling?
I think it is. I think it's a safer time, right? I think that there is, when we talk about time and place for everything, we have to be realistic that everything needs safety. It needs space to bloom and grow. And I think more important, and I'm just talking from like a corporate standpoint, from a business standpoint, as a business operator and leader. I don't think that most business leaders, especially those who have businesses and logos that we see every single day in the world, feel comfortable all the time stating their intent. Now you see we are an anti-racist company. We are an anti-sexist company. Those things are safe to say now.
I don't think that I felt comfortable or confident to be intentional in my role, and I've been privileged to be in a leadership role in HR for many years, ahead of my time. But up until last year, I felt uncomfortable using the word Black out loud, writing it down in messages to our entire organization, referencing myself as Black in leadership team meetings. And I think it was last year where I became more unapologetic personally about the role and responsibility I have as a leader in HR to ensure DE&I is part of the conversation and that we have accountability for achieving our objectives. And I want to say one other thing. For me, I realize that being a leader in HR, you've got a big tent. I'm accountable for the majority, and those are white males, white females, but all different backgrounds. And I think for many years in HR, I felt like my identity had to become secondary. So I couldn't advocate for blacks in the workforce or black women or women in the workforce because I had to spread out. But my intentionality now is that I can do both, and that's okay.
And what drove that? Was that the context around us? Was there a change in a conversation at work that changed how you view people at work? Was it just your evolution as a human being?
You know, I have a mentor from when I worked at Merck, and she was the chief diversity officer at Merck for several years, Deb Daggett. She also happens to be a little person. And hearing her describe her journey with advocacy for people with disabilities, she, for several years in her capacity leading DE&I, or D&I at the time it was called, she put her identity secondary because, but she, following her, career and her retirement, she said, this is who I am. She was literally there at the signing of the ADA. And how many opportunities could she have used her privilege and power and platform to advocate while she was in the role? And she did, but it wasn't as forward as she has become an advocate now. And so I don't want to have that reality. I want to be able to, while I'm in the seat, to be able to represent diversity, a big tent for everyone, but also there are constituencies that I have an affinity towards, and I want to make sure there's advocacy for those constituencies too.
And so I want to jump into talking about what people have been doing at work to be intentional and drive diversity. It could be within your organization, it could be in partner organizations. And Laura, you and I were talking about the work you're doing and the fact that, you may be able to diversify talent. I was saying this to you, you may be able to diversify talent pools in small organizations, but a lot of times a small organization has this other superpower that they work on every single day, this, in your case, investing, where you can have a much bigger impact. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing and how you think about it?
Sure, I'll give a little bit of context first. I run Plexo Capital. We are an institutional investor allocating capital across investment opportunities in the tech ecosystem. We invest as a limited partner into seed stage or early stage venture funds led by women and people of color, and then we also invest directly into companies. The strategy started at Google Ventures, now rebranded as GV, which is the early stage investing unit for Alphabet, Google's holding company. We had a strategy, this is back in 2014, 2015. I was a partner on the investing team, and Larry and Sergey, Google's founders, wanted us to deploy more capital. And we had this really interesting thesis about partnering with seed stage funds led by black GPs first, because what we saw was that their indirect path into venture capital really lent itself to having these unique networks to get access to differentiated deal flow. But then the real piece de la resistance, I just got back from France, was the fact that we also saw that it drove some alpha as well. So the ability to have some, outsized returns kind of based on, a little secret. And the secret was that those black GPs were able to use their lens to be able to identify opportunities at the early stage before there was a lot of data, to be able to have some familiarity with markets knowing that they were going to be big opportunities. Plus, a different lens into evaluating founders, so founders that some might overlook. So we were able to successfully use that strategy, and so successful that I said, hey, I'd love to be able to spin that out as a standalone, which they let me do, incubated it at GV for a little period of time. But when I was going to raise capital, and this will be a good shift for George Floyd. When I was going to raise capital, I had a lot of head scratching. Wait, you're going to invest into funds led by women and people of color to drive alpha? I don't understand that. But fortunately, enough folks did understand it. Alphabet, Intel, Cisco, Royal Bank of Canada, Hampton University, the Ford Foundation. So we were able to successfully demonstrate that we could use the strategy to deliver returns. But my story was really focused on the returns piece. Now, the good news is that one of the, I think a positive outcome of the unfortunate killing of, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many others before and many others after, is that there was that shift, right? So people could get comfortable saying, you know what? No, I want to raise a fund that focuses on Black entrepreneurs, right? That's a huge shift because I think with our model, the focus on delivering returns, it has a positive impact on the overall ecosystem because we can help to get more capital to these early stage managers and provide some positive signal to hopefully make the fundraise process a little smoother for them. But I just think that I'm super excited for the fact that we can now say, hey, you know what? I'm a Black investor and I'm going to invest in Black companies. Like that's a huge change, and people are raising funds doing that. So, there's definitely intention with the ability to be able to comfortably say that.
It's interesting when you look at the psychological research around intent and all stuff like that. What comes up over and over again is that it's about focus, but communication is a big part of it. Being very clear about where you're going, and as you're going along that path. That came up in our conversation with each other. So curious about other examples of people being intentional. Either you or your team have been intentional over the last year, 2 years, 5 years, that either worked or didn't work.
Well, for me, I think it was refreshing where I am at class that my managers, many of them said, we have our challenges with diversity, but immediately they said, it wasn't by design that we have, white males in these roles, but these were our friends, and we were growing fast, and we hired our friends. And the fact they communicated, recognized it as an issue, and said this is something we want to intentionally fix. It was just like it wasn't much of a fight for me. I didn't have to prove why it was necessary, and so I just think that open communication, recognizing, your responsibility and recognizing maybe you're not a flaw, but something that you missed. I've been lucky enough to deal with people in leadership that have recognized that and are willing to make the change. So
Odessa, that part of why you're saying it's safer is because you can admit you messed up, or you're not as where you want to be, or you're not sure what to do.
Yeah, and I think it's also about risk, right? There are a lot more, at least I'm willing, as an executive leader, to take more risk now, and I think that courage that has come into a lot of us as executive leaders. It's not just Black leaders, all leaders, cisgendered white male leaders who I know who are colleagues of mine are now saying, you know what, I think that's wrong, and I'm just gonna say it. It's like, yeah, dude, you're in charge. Like, did you forget? And I think a lot of times we forget our power because we are so consumed by what and who we serve. And I think that this time in the world has made me more intentional. I recently joined as president of Emtrain. It's right over 3 months ago. And we're in the thick of this training, learning, building, upskilling space. In areas of respect and ethics and inclusion, like I'm in the thick of it. And so for me, how I'm being intentional is being really clear about my language. When I address the company and in all hands, I use the words I intend: women, Black, gay, straight. And I think that I'm willing to take that risk, and I'm starting to notice immediately, particularly in areas where we have functional areas like our tech team, our engineers, they aren't as willing to take risk without data. But now I see my engineering leaders saying things like, I want to hire more women. Where 3 months ago it was, let's have more diversity on the team. right? Being more intentional with my language influenced them to be more intentional with theirs, and that gets us to the desired outcome. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We have to be specific with what we want, but there's a risk to that, right? There's a risk to saying those things because you can overcorrect. Yeah. But I'm willing to overcorrect.
Yeah. I'm curious about people's reactions or other versions of being intentional or taking risk.
How do you overcorrect? That's a good
How do you overcorrect is the question?
Yeah, so I think that anytime let me give you an example. So I came from a company where it was a founder-led business for 5 years before I got there. And I was employee 33, and it was in technology. And when I walked into the room, it was clear that I was the only black woman. I was the only openly gay person in the business. And I wanted it to change. I wanted it to change day 2, right? It's like, wait a minute, the stats don't match. And so I went to the management team, the founder and CEO, and said, listen, if I'm gonna stand next to you and we're gonna change this business, we're gonna sell this business, we're gonna be successful. We have 23 clients now, we're gonna have 600 when I leave. We're gonna do that. If we are going to do that, we're gonna do it with more women, more black people, more openly gay people, right? And his response was, as a cisgendered white male, well, doesn't that mean that you aren't going to want to hire white people, straight people, non-gay people? And it was a very honest moment that people weren't willing to have out loud at that time. He was pretty progressive, because now you're willing to have those conversations in the room with each other, say, well, let's have this talk. What does that do for people like me? And I think that that's where the safety comes in. You can overcorrect, especially people like me. I think when we talk about inclusion, there are things that we don't know about. There are groups of people that we have to make room for that aren't us, with disabilities, right? Globalization of our workforce, ageism. Admittedly, I'm a young executive, comparatively. I don't exactly know how to work with generations that are older than me or much younger than me. I'm learning that, right? And so I think that I can overcorrect. That's exactly what I mean.
The overcorrect thing is something I'm very sensitive to. When I experience people talking about overcorrection, my reaction is, well, you're going to still try, right? Like it usually stops the conversation because there's worry about an overcorrection, and I worry that we're equating the possibility of an overcorrection with the probability that we're undercorrected or underinvested in whatever we're talking about.
That's exactly what I mean by risk, though. I'm willing to take the risk, and I think that everyone else has to be willing to take that risk. But I think for us to talk about diversity and not talk about people losing power, changing jobs, workforces changing, dynamics changing, is not being honest. And so we have to make space for what does that mean? And I think that the fact that there is a pie that's big enough, or that we can go create more pies, is what needs to be discussed. To your point, talking about raising money for black companies has not at all stopped white black males from raising money, has it?
Not one bit.
Exactly. So I think that natural fear of overcorrection, right? That we need to be cognizant of it. And me, as someone who's intentionally doing this work, I have to know how to rebut that. I have to know how to address it.
And so one of the things that was embedded in a couple of your comments was data. Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit about data being a clear driver of this. I just wanted someone to comment on that or pick up on that.
Yeah, I think for us, the data is really interesting because we probably all have heard the stats around the lack of venture capital available for women, for any person of color, black people in particular, black women in particular. Actually, that's like the lowest group to actually receive venture capital. But you know, we try at our firm, we try to turn the table on data. So we track over 1,200 firms now, and we've had a touch point with over 450. And, you know, almost 40% or so are led by, these are investment firms. These are early stage venture capital funds that typically have less than, call it 100 million in AUM. So they're investing at the very early stage. That's where you actually see the diversity. And that tends to really open people's eyes when they discover all of the talent that's available. And most of this talent was at the larger firms and hit the proverbial glass ceiling. And then they decided to go out and start their own firm. So, we try to turn the table by using data to show the power of the number of general partners that are Black, women, people of color that are leading venture funds, and then also showing the success, because there's a lot of data. In fact, there's a gentleman, Darren Dodson, who leads Lumen Capital, and he did a partnership with Stanford University that kind of even shows that, the numbers show that these early stage managers actually perform really well. And then there's a different kind of discrimination that happens where the numbers show that the better that some managers perform, the less likely they are to actually receive funding relative to white males. Fascinating study. Double-blind test where people couldn't see the actual leaders of the firms. But then the data showed that the people that are running these firms, and I think one of the things that I've just learned just anecdotally, my uncle used to always, he was an admiral in the Navy, and he used to always tell me that, look, you're gonna have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and it's gonna take you twice as long, and you just have to get comfortable with that. And so I think that permeates through a lot of the people that I talk to, and we just know we have to be good, right? Whether it's on the investing side or whether it's on the entrepreneur side. And so, the data proves it out. There are amazing investors that are leading that are Black-led funds. And so we try to take a different spin on the data and show the power that exists within the numbers of the people that are leading these firms and the results that they're delivering.
Marissa, I wanted to ask you, part of this is about also being intentional in ways that allows space for other people to join this fight or to help make progress. Is there anything that either you've seen, that you all have done, or things you've seen in the marketplace that you kind of hold up as examples of people being intentional about their strategy to diversify their workforce or the people around them that seem to work?
Yeah, well, I'll answer it with two pieces because I do believe in data, and I think both quantitative and qualitative. So at Turnitin, if you look quantitatively, at least within the U.S., where we measure demographics, we have a pretty diverse employee population when you consider gender and you consider ethnic diversity. We're at 44% women across our workforce. If we look at director and above, it's at 52%. It's pretty strong. From an ethnicity standpoint, 25%. Diversity from an ethnicity standpoint, and we look at underrepresented groups. So, for example, we look at those ethnicities or races beyond Asian Pacific Islander because they're a majority of that population, not to discount or be at the exclusion of, but we're honing in on the underrepresented groups. And then when we look at that stat for directors and above, it moves to 11-12% for ethnicity. So the thing about metrics is as we're moving into more of a global environment, and Turnitin operates globally, we have over 15 offices around the world. The construct of race and ethnicity doesn't mean the same thing. Like, it doesn't translate. Gender does. Self-identification from a gender standpoint does, and we can measure that. But we're in a place now where we're trying to get on the same page of what are the rest of the lenses of diversity, and how can we define that uniformly across the globe? Still a work in progress, but I'm up for the challenge, and so is my team, to define that. From a qualitative standpoint, we do an employee engagement survey, and we do it just about every quarter, and we look at those results. And, I think it's important to get leadership on the same page around what your aspirations are. So both from a representation standpoint, and that's the quantitative, but also, what is the essence of belonging? What is that level of, I want to work for this company. I want to grow my career here because I feel like the work that I do and I personally matter. That's the qualitative context that comes through when we do our engagement surveys. And so we can look at the comments and we can look at it by age group, age classification, gender, location. And that tells a very different story. 80% of our people believe that all people from all different backgrounds can succeed at Turnitin. But then when we ask the question and get to the comments around belonging and what that means for you, the scores are not as high. And so that's something for us as leaders and managers to explore with our people, to make sure that we are cultivating the environment that works for everyone.
Yeah, and just to jump in real quick about data, data is required for us to be intentional. Like, we can't just imagine that we're doing okay because optics say so, or even, through the engagement surveys, because we do the same thing. If we don't have numbers to sort of measure our success by, then how do we know that we've made a difference? So data is really important with the intentionality, with diversity, so.
Yeah, this came up on a panel I was on yesterday, which is, you have operational targets, sales targets, strategic targets, but no targets for the people who are going to do all those things. Mm-hmm. And it's a complete inconsistency. But there seems to be a lot of pressure to change that. One of the things that feels different, and I'd love to have you all comment on this, is that if you go back to the summer of 2016, you had someone turn their car into a weapon in Nice, you had the Orlando nightclub shooting, you had black men and boys getting shot, you had a cop in Dallas shot in retribution. And you would have thought the world was going to really change. But the pressure on companies was largely external, so it was more of a crisis communications pressure. Since then with Me Too and then BLM and George Floyd's murder, it seems to have shifted much more internally, with employee populations pressuring organizations, which is a significant difference because they're not going anywhere. Like, it's not a moment that's going to pass with them. You're all nodding your head, so jump in. What do you think about that?
For me, it started with us. And when I say us, I mean Black men and women in leadership or not in leadership in companies. I think that the murder of George Floyd and the summer of 19 really changed the risk we were willing to take. And you saw, it's all over the news, executive level leaders walking away from companies who weren't willing to be intentional, who weren't willing to address diversity head on, who weren't willing to stand up and say something and devise a plan. So I think that movement that you're talking about started with people being willing to leave, not stay. And because competitively, if you can't retain employees, then your business is not going to do well. So I think it started there. But there's also this sentiment that once your leadership is there and is intentional, and you know that they are willing to have a plan, then I think it's also the employee base coming together and saying, we work for a company that is working on a plan, that has made it clear on who they are and who they are not. And that does something to you, particularly as a person of color, as a Black woman, as a Black lesbian woman, standing in a company that you have intentional words being used to address something that disproportionately impacts you, means something. So I think that's where it went. Can I say something about data real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because I think we talked about the demographic data, and I think it's really important that we address these competencies and skills that drive us to get these outcomes. And if I can, because I want to provide solutions, like I don't want to be up here lecturing people. I think if you're looking for ways to be more intentional with your data, then it's not just how you measure your data, it's how you measure the skills and competencies that are going to drive to your data. How do you measure behavior today in your company? There's performance, but how are you measuring behavior? How are you quantifying good behavior from bad behavior? This is what gets me excited about what we do with Emtrain, because we're providing tools that say, here's what good behavior looks like. Here's what bad behavior looks like. I know it's very rudimentary and elementary, but if we don't all define it, how can we truly measure?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's elementary at all. I think it's evolutionary because it, if you say, is my manager trying to be inclusive, you're like, yeah, he's trying.
Right.
But to ask, over the past 2 months, my manager has met with me one-on-one weekly, every other week. My manager has asked me about me once in a while, frequently, all the time. Being able to observable behaviors give you better data, but it's also then easy to say, okay, here are my positive outliers. Here's what they're doing that's different from everybody else. I'm going to tell those people so they keep doing it, but I can signal to everybody else. Exactly. And that's I don't think that's rudimentary at all. That's actually, most people's employee opinion surveys don't look like that right now, but they're heading in that direction.
Yeah, it's revolutionary in that it's going back to how we truly intentionally change people's behavior, because we're not going to get where we want to get if people don't change.
So I want to hear a story about anyone recently who had all the intent in the world and then hit a brick wall, with either internally or externally, and just what did you do? I'm just curious.
Well, I have chosen not to continue to receive a paycheck when I've been hit by that brick wall, and you make decisions. I want to offer something, because even with the diversity stats and the demographics that I just mentioned, data can make things look good, and you can make the data make things look good. But I have had conversations with our leadership team and my past leadership teams that would say, it's great to measure when you're looking just at director and above, but when you start to go up the chain and get to VP and the C-suite, how does that diversity shift? And then it becomes very near in proximity to the makeup of those groups. I think it's really important to take the time to level set with your leadership team. And, I started at Turnitin in May, and I think we still have time to work together and to get on the same page. But I have tended to ask the question of people who don't look like me on the leadership team, when is it that you came to know diversity and inclusion in your life? What happened in your life that you became to even know about it? And then I pull that thread to kind of explore, okay, these were the circumstances that either made you a believer in humanity and things associated with empathy, or these are the things that, left you conflicted. And then I can have a conversation with you about that. But I think, we've gotten to a place post-2020 where, I don't know, maybe it's the overcorrection or maybe it's the cancel culture that we're reverting from wanting to engage in these open conversations as senior executives, because it's like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to, I know we need more women, but isn't that, in itself prejudice, to make an assertion like that, And it's a very uncomfortable place. So I'm going back to let's just have this open dialogue so I understand your history and the personal experiences, what happened in your life when you were 11 on the playground that made you believe this thing about diversity? Or, what was it of how you were brought up or where you grew up that made you have this thought pattern that's still the residual in this hallway, in this Zoom conversation today, and blocking us from moving forward? I think we need to spend more time opening the door for our executives to get on the same page and not assume that everybody from 2020 got real woke and has the same appreciation for DE&I.
Yeah, no, and you all were talking about it earlier, which is like it's a lot like First Amendment rights. Like the standard for First Amendment rights is not that everybody gets to say stuff if I agree with them. It's someone standing in front of me who isn't yelling fire in a crowded building or inciting violence, saying something I just don't agree with, but I respect the right that they have to say it. So, for all of us, it's important to create the space for people to disagree
Yes.
in adult terms and have a full-throated adult conversation about it. And I would actually say that's an odd benefit of this current moment is like you kind of know where people stand a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can actually talk to them. I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Yeah, my grandmother used to always tell me that she grew up in Prairie View, Texas. And she said, well, the benefit of growing up in Texas was that I always knew where people stood on race. No, but I do want to go back. I agree with your thoughts on kind of where we are right now and coming from leadership. There's another point, we talked about this earlier, which is I'm very hopeful for the kind of millennials, Gen Z, and younger generations, because when I think about their approach to making decisions around investing into companies, buying companies' products, and working for companies, they definitely want to see good on the front end, as opposed to, and I use the United example when the doctor got pulled off of the plane, as opposed to kind of seeing it reactionary on the back end, right? And so I'm very hopeful that the younger generations are going to continue to push for more and really try to hold companies accountable, both externally, investing and buying products, and internally when they're working for companies.
Odessa, do you want to jump on that too?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point because when we talk about intention, we haven't talked about, you have obviously with capital raise, but where companies are putting their dollars. And when we talk about being intentional, I think we'd be remiss not to mention that diversity doesn't have to be a line item, but it has to be accounted for financially. So I think we need to have a conversation, and I don't think we all have this figured out, but we need to have a conversation on how you are representing diversity financially in your financial metrics, right? So it might be very early stage now where it's one line item that looks out of place. It's that your CFO's like, what the hell is that, right? But I think that we really need to start developing where does this fit financially. How am I showing that I'm making an investment in my company, period? Like, I don't think this is how do I show that I'm making an investment in diversity and how do I show that I'm making an investment in my people to ensure that my company looks and feels the way they want it to.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to start with you, Odessa, and work back this way, pick up on something Lotus said. Are you optimistic when it comes to the path towards greater diversity and inclusion in all its forms? Would you describe yourself as optimistic and why?
I think I'm an optimist in general, just because I come from a really hard place, and I think to your point, I learned early on that I was going to have to be optimistic to get where I want to be. I think we have a lot of work to do. I think a lot of people are letting us down. So although I'm optimistic, I don't know in my lifetime that people that look like me and experience life the way that I do are going to have equal opportunity in this world. And to me, that's the end game.
I'm a Pisces. I am my father's daughter, and so yes, I'm optimistic, and I'm also surrounded by a number of leaders who are on the same page with me at Turnitin for DE&I.
I am pragmatically optimistic, but I'm optimistic.
Yep.
And the thing that I always think about is people ask me, with our model, we focus on diverse-led funds, Black GPs, females, other people of color. They ask me, well, when will your model be obsolete? And I always answer, not soon enough.
Yeah, I too am a Pisces and optimistic as well. I work for a great company at Class. We talk about changing the way the world learns, and through that, we want our people to be as diverse as the communities we serve. And so, having the buy-in from the leadership team, I finally feel like I'm in a place where I can make the changes that'll change the world. So I'm optimistic.
Great. Well, I'm optimistic because you all are. So thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank
Really
you for
appreciate
being
it.
here.
Thank you.